Okay, we're going to get started. Because this is on air, the broadcast has already started because we're streaming it out. So if we could all settle down. Uh, well, we made it to the end of the conference. Thank you. It's great to see everybody in person again. It's my pleasure to introduce our closing speaker, Dr. Kevin Gannon. Kevin is a director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning and professor of history at Grandview University in Des Moines, Iowa, where he's taught since 2004. His teaching, research, and writing focuses on critical and inclusive pedagogy, race, history, and justice, as well as on effective uses of educational technology. Kevin is a frequent contributor to the Chronicle of Higher Education, Vox, and many other publications. He's the author of Radical Hope, a teaching manifesto, which is a superb and inspirational book. That's another superb book in the West Virginia University series on teaching and learning, edited by Jim Lang and Michelle Miller. Kevin is currently writing a textbook on the U.S. Civil War and Reconstruction eras that's grounded in settler colonial theory for Routledge. You may have also have seen him on the Oscar-nominated documentary 13, which has been available on Netflix, which was directed by Ava DuVernay. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, John. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, good, excellent. So good morning, and thank you for having me here. Thanks for inviting me to the conference. I have been here since Wednesday afternoon and thoroughly enjoyed myself. And I know in-person conferences are still kind of this weird kind of liminal space where it's like, hey, it's great, we're in person together. Oh, hey, we're in person together. So I get, but it's, what really has struck me about this gathering is that you all genuinely seem to enjoy being around one another, or else all of you are really good actors and actresses. And that's not true everywhere, but there seems to be a sense of community and of common purpose and investment here. That's really, I have found to be refreshing and energizing, and coming off of the academic year that we've all just had, a little bit of refreshment and re-energizing is certainly a welcome thing. So I'm very appreciative of that and appreciative of the opportunity to come and join you for this last session. So what does it mean to think about a pedagogy of hope in the times that we're in? Some might say a time of monsters. This is me before the coffee maker turns on, in case you're wondering. This may not strike you as a very intuitive, or it may strike you as more of a counterintuitive thing to talk about, right? What does it mean to think about something like hope in the times that we're in right now? And as someone who's trained as a historian, I'm lucky to have all sorts of technical language that I can use to describe our present day context. Trash fire comes to mind. But really, we are certainly not in a post-COVID landscape, for example. It's tempting for us to want to frame things that way, but we're not post anything. So we can talk about new chapters. We can talk about turning corners, I think. We can talk about a new phase for higher education. But again, as someone who's trained as a historian, I can tell you that just because something is new or just because time has gone on doesn't mean it got better. And in fact, oftentimes the opposite is the case. And so I want to acknowledge that any work that we're doing and what we're trying to do either on our individual level and the capacities that we interface with our institutions and our colleagues and our students, all the way up to the system level, which has been, of course, the object of a lot of discussion and strategizing here at this conference, too. All of that is taking place within a larger context, our larger socio-political and cultural context that is extremely fraught and dangerous and violent in our current moment. What is a global pandemic but slow-rolling, slowly unfolding violence and trauma? Many of us have experienced loss directly as a result of COVID. Almost all of us, and I say us speaking broadly, have experienced loss in at least a vicarious or indirect sense. And certainly when we think about the work that it is that we do with and among one another and with and among our students, we lost a lot in the shift to emergency remote instruction in the spring of 2020. We lost control over learning environments and teaching and learning spaces that we had constructed. we lost control over ways in which we were able to shape the experience of our students, and our students felt a sense of loss in many ways as well from the connections and the community that they had invested so much of themselves in creating before everything dispersed and went out into the cyber ether. And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there is loss associated with anything that we're talking about moving forward into this next phase in American higher education. And of course, that loss is being felt and being experienced by so many of us against a backdrop that seems to ignore or even minimize that loss, where even basic public health measures, where, based on the idea that one should be considerate of the people in community spaces with them, where those became objects of political ire and political wrath, or even the basic, hey, be cool to one another, became a problematic concept. And so the demoralization and the frustration and the sadness that comes along with that is also an important part of shaping the context in which we're operating. And remember back in, the early months of the pandemic, which still feels weird to say, right? It simultaneously feels like 2 minutes and 20 years ago that all this occurred, right? But remember in those early months, all of the sort of feel-good, can-do rhetoric that we had, flatten the curve, we're going to beat COVID, we're going to mobilize all of the resources of the United States and its people and its capacity to beat the unbeatable. Like, we're going to do all these things and we're going to beat COVID. And now, even worldwide, we're here a couple years later like, COVID, what are you going to do? Guess it's here. Guess we'll have to learn to live with it. And while I'm not an epidemiologist, I do understand what endemic means, right? And maybe this was how it was going to be, but it's still demoralizing, right? It's still demoralizing to go from that place of can-do spirit and let's chip in together and let's, affect solidarity and beat this thing and flatten the curve to kind of a collective shrugging of the shoulders. And of course, we know COVID was not something that impacted all of us equitably or equally, right? There are a number of ways I could represent the disparities, and this data visualization is just one of them. But we know that the coronavirus disparately affected African American and Black communities in the United States in terms of both cases and mortality. So this was a slowly unfolding, rolling pandemic that laid bare already existing disparities and inequities in our society and made many of them literally a matter of life and death. And against the slow rolling violence of a pandemic, we saw the eruptions of violence in a much more dramatic, accelerated, and shocking form, whether it was the anti-Asian violence in Atlanta, or whether it was in the halls of the nation's capital, January 6th of 2021. The summer before that, which again feels simultaneously immediate and so long ago. Many of us and our students were in the streets in areas across the country, from small towns to large urban areas, protesting another type of violence, state violence against people of color and marginalized communities. And of course, acknowledging the international scope of the violence. Authoritarianism is on the rise globally, and the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is one of the most visible, but certainly not the only manifestations of that we're seeing in our immediate context, shaping quite literally where we are here and now. So again, as someone who's trained as a historian, I am often leery about using the word crisis because I think it's easy for us to overuse that term and perhaps rob it of some of its meaning. My own theory is that as someone who's working on a textbook project right now, crisis is one of those words that makes a really good chapter title, right? So you have the crisis of X and the crisis of... But where are we now if not a crisis? Where are we now if not this? Even before COVID, the status quo before COVID, we know now in ways that maybe some of us had not understood before, that previous normal, that status quo was unsustainable, even if not every one of us realized it. Certainly now, there's no avoiding it. We are in a time of crisis. In another time of crisis, about 100 years ago, the Italian newspaper editor and communist politician Antonio Gramsci found himself in a prison cell in Italy, one of the earliest victims of the persecution of the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini that had swept over the country and enforced violent ethno-nationalist rule in a rapid, bewilderingly rapid amount of time. And one of the things that Gramsci tried to wrestle with in a prison sentence that quite literally broke his health and led to his death eventually, Gramsci wrote, looking at what happened in Italy. The crisis, he said, in which he found himself, consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And so the old is dying, right? The status quo was untenable. The new cannot be born. So the next chapter, today we might call it the new normal. What does that look like? That's contested. There's no inevitable answer. And in that interregnum, as visions of that new come into contact and conflict with one another, the potential for violence, for social breakdown, and for a loss of legitimacy in the very government itself can pave the way for all sorts of what Gramsci called morbid symptoms. A necrotizing society, a society where death, where anti-life is at the middle of things. And lest you think that that's remote, look at where we are now with the epidemic of gun violence in this country. A great variety of morbid symptoms appear. In a translation of Gramsci's work, the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Zizek rendered Gramsci's original Italian a little more dramatically, and if you've ever read Zizek, overly wrought dramatic language is kind of his jam. But he translated this passage from Gramsci as the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. And while, yes, that may seem overwrought, what is historic levels of income inequality but a monstrous problem? What is the growing number of people in our society who do not have access to what should be seen as the basic rights of living in a society, like healthcare and housing? What is that ever-increasing number, if not a monstrous problem? What are mass shootings, if not a monstrous problem? What is the slow strangulation of education in this country? Financial and otherwise, increasing, if not a monstrous problem. Maybe we are in the time of monsters. And at this point, you are probably sitting here or online thinking that this is the shittiest talk on hope that you have ever been to. And who is this guy? And what happened on his trip here? Right? So, I'm a fan of solutions-oriented discourse, but solutions imply the existence of problems. And all too often, we are eager to sort of skip lightly past an acknowledgement of the true dimensions of the problems that we face in our search for solutions that may or may not be effective, but that make us feel better about ignoring the problems that we're facing. And so when we talk about acting from an ethic of hope, which is what I hope to instill here with us today, the first thing that that sense of hope requires is an unflinching honesty about where we find ourselves. If we are going to lie to ourselves about where we are now and what we face now, then there's no way we're able to create the type of better future, the more just and more sustainable future that it is we want. If we lie to ourselves about where we are now in higher education, then how do we create something sustainable for this next chapter that we're embarking on now? If we're unwilling to acknowledge, for example, that the systems we've created in higher education do not work equitably for all of our students, and in fact, actively work against some of our students. If we're unwilling to be honest about that now, how do we fix those things going forward? How do we create a future for higher education where those inequities don't exist? Every institution in the country right now is talking about a commitment to DEI, to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But does that commitment go beyond words? Because actions for equity are actions for justice. And so it's not just about who appears on our viewbook photos or on the campus publicity online. It's what are we doing? We speaking collectively. I'm implicating all of us in here. What are we doing with and for all of our students? If we're not honest about what we're not doing now, then we can't get to where it is that we need to go. And so what might this thing look like? What does a pedagogical praxis, in other words, that combination of theory and practice? So acknowledging, a sense of praxis is that I acknowledge and am explicit about the philosophical, the ideological orientation that I have. This is what I believe about teaching and learning and how it works best. This is what I believe about my students. This is what my institution means. This is what our mission is. So that theory, but then also the daily practice. How am I putting that theory into operation? Even in the everyday, boring routine, what am I putting on my syllabus? What am I doing in my 9 o'clock class next Tuesday? What does the LMS look like? How are we supporting students in hybrid learning? The seemingly routine decisions that make up our workaday lives on a minute-by-minute basis, that's the practice. And only by those things working together, theory and practice. Theory informs practice. Practice helps us reflect on theory. We reshape that approach to reshape our practice. So a continuous motion, a continuous process. What does it look like when we do that if it's rooted in hope? And what does it look like to do that rooted in hope during this time of monsters? That's the question that I hope to get us thinking about today. And in order to do that, let's sit with this concept of hope here for a minute too. Right? Hope is one of those words that we tend to sort of use very blithely and kind of abuse a little bit and maybe rob it of some of its meaning and its urgency. One of the most common ways that we see people talk about hope is that, I have hope in the future, right? I believe in the children. The children are our future, right? But what that is, that's a very common sort of societal trope that, this assumption that time will pass, and because of the fact that time has passed, things will be better. Right? How do we know they're better? Because it won't be now, and we know now sucks, right? But that's an incomplete process of reasoning, because what that does is it helps us take the off ramp if we want. If I say I have hope in the future, because things will naturally be better in the future. Today's students will fix the problems of the previous generation. What I'm doing is I'm offloading any of my responsibility in that process, and I'm putting that burden on other people. And so I am no longer responsible, implicated, or accountable. But hope can't be like that if it's to be something meaningful, right? Many of you might have heard the cliche before, hope without action is fantasy, right? I can't say I have hope in the future if I'm not doing any of the work to bring about that better future. That's just a cruel joke. Rebecca Solnit, in her 2004 essay, Hope in the Dark, framed hope in a way that I think offers us a lot to sort of sit with and to give us some meaning when we think about this, right? Hope, she says, is not a lottery ticket that you sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky. It's an axe that you break down doors with in an emergency, right? And I remember the first time I read this essay, I'm like, that is a vivid metaphor, right? I mean, the first thing that went into my head was the scene from The Shining where Jack Nicholson goes through the door, right? Here's Johnny. And, but Solnit does this for a purpose, right? She grabs us as the reader and says, look, this is what I'm talking about. Don't just hold that lottery ticket with the 1 in a million chance that you might win. Pick up the axe and go breaking down some doors. Because again, if we're not in an emergency now, when is that going to be? What does that term even mean, right? But what really strikes me as powerful about Solnit's observation here is how she talks about hope as a commitment to the future. Right? We don't need to know the exact shape of that future. right? I can say, I have hope in the future and I am working towards a more just and sustainable future. I can't tell you what that's going to look like exactly, but I can be doing the work to bring it about nonetheless. I can commit to that vision, and I can commit to being in solidarity with everyone else around me who is committing to that vision or committing to a vision of a more just and sustainable future, right? That commitment, Solnit says, is what makes the present inhabitable. So how do you live and act with hope in a meaningful way when things don't get better immediately? I think this is the key to help us understand that. Committing to a better future, a more hopeful future, if you will, making our present inhabitable. Because we understand then that where we find ourselves now was not inevitable. Where we are now is largely the product of choices that were made. Perhaps unconsciously, but choices nonetheless. And the context in which those choices were made as well. But context can change, and we can make different choices. Both of those things are eminently controllable by us. And so that lends us agency. That gives us power. We've always had it, but we haven't acknowledged that we've had it, and we haven't picked up the tools necessarily that it gives us. So let's think of hope maybe in this sense. And I'm borrowing this formulation from the educational developers Peter Felton and Susanna McGowan, who write about a meaningful sense of hope in a higher educational context. And not just for students, but for folks like us, for the faculty and staff who are working in these institutional settings, especially over the last few years, thinking, how do we do this in a hopeful, in a meaningful way? And what McGowan and Felton challenge us to think about hope as, again, not just something empty and airy, not the lottery ticket on the couch, right? But hope is the combination, the sum of two important components working together, agency and pathways. Both of these are important, but either one alone is insufficient unto itself. And so think about it in this context, right? In a higher ed context, one of the things my university struggles with a lot, and we are a university with a mission oriented towards access. Many of the students at my university come from communities that have been marginalized and underserved historically, especially by higher ed. Many of our students come to us as the only option to continue their education after high school. And one of the things that a lot of our students struggle with is mathematics. And I'm not picking on any of my math colleagues here, but math anxiety is a thing generally, right? And for many of our students who have experienced lack of success, sometimes in a jarring way in math, to be told you have to complete a quantitative literacy requirement as part of our core curriculum. Or if you want to major in X, you have to get through this particular level of mathematics. And for a student who's placed into the kind of developmental or general intro math, they are being told, we're going to make you do this thing again, this thing that you have not been successful at before. And if you're not successful this time, that's the end of the road. That's what the student is seeing in this setting. That student comes into this math class literally hopeless. That is, not believing that a successful outcome is possible. Hopeless students cannot learn. And so our job as educators then, the question we have to wrestle with then is, how do we get these students out of a place of hopelessness to enter this academic setting, which will be a challenging one for them, with hope? That is, with a concrete, meaningful sense that a better outcome is not only possible, but imminently achievable. We cannot just tell that student, hey, if you work really hard, you're going to pass and do fine, right? Because chances are that student has worked really hard before and has not passed. And if there's one thing we know about college students, they have very finely calibrated bullshit detectors, right? And we set that thing off once and we've lost trust. What we say past that point is going to lose its meaning. So we can't just give them those empty platitudes, right? So how does that student act with hope? Well, the first thing they need is a sense of agency, right? That student needs to believe that they have the agency, they have the power to make specific choices, and as a result of the decisions that they make and the things that they do, a successful outcome will happen. So I have it within my power, right? And so anytime we get students thinking metacognitively, right? As a learner, it's not just you're having stuff thrown at you and hopefully some of it sticks. You are a learner and you are an active part of that process. You can make decisions. You can adopt strategies that will help you learn more and help you learn better and help you learn more meaningfully. So that's the first part, right? Agency. It is within your power as a learner, as an agent, to bring about a successful outcome, even when you don't have any evidence right now to suggest that that outcome is possible. But in and of itself, the agency part isn't enough, right? Because what do you do with that agency? If it's within your power, great, but how do you use that power? And so that's the second portion of this equation here, right? Pathways. And ideally, the more the better, right? And so that student uses their agency to make decisions about different study strategies, the math lab, supplemental instruction, working with the instructor during office hours, any and all of these and others that we have, the student support services that we put in front of them, right? And it's through the combination of the agency deployed along those pathways that the better outcome is achieved. That's how we build hope with students. But this is also how we build hope with ourselves. What's your agency? Where do you have the power to change things? That's going to look different depending where you are, what department you're in, how you intersect with the institution. If you're an institutional leader or an administrator, your agency is helping other people find and use theirs in addition to the things that you do personally, right? And on what pathways are you going to deploy your agency, right? Hope is agency plus pathways. I can make things better, and here are the ways that I can set about that work. We might not see the immediate results right away. That student in the math class might not see the immediate results right away, but there's traction. There's possibility where none had existed before. And that possibility brings momentum. That momentum brings motivation. That motivation brings success. So much of what we know about student learning, right? This is simple growth mindset stuff. So much of what we know about student learning we can apply as insights into our own work in the institutions right now. How do we deploy that agency? What are the pathways that we use? What does it mean to act with hope? Well, one of the main things that we need to be about in whatever this new chapter ends up being called in higher education is to dismantle the structures of inequality that are shaping almost everything that we and our students are or are not able to do. The default process for structures of inequality, like racism, like poverty, is for those structures to reproduce themselves over time. Every generation, that structure will reproduce itself. In U.S. history, we go from race-based enslavement to Jim Crow, to voting disfranchisement, to de facto as opposed to de jure segregation in schools, like we're seeing now, for example. The structure of inequality mutates, it evolves. That is the default process. How do we interrupt that process? We have to actively intervene. And so if you look throughout U.S. history, when have we seen those processes stop? With active intervention from people who have made the decision that this is no longer sustainable and or satisfactory, right? So how do we intervene? How do we unplug those processes as they work in our institutions? What is our intervention to close racial equity gaps in persistence and retention and graduation rates? What is our intervention to avoid the trap of gender imbalance in class discussions and active learning? What is our strategy? What are our pathways? What are our agencies to close the digital divide? Especially in an era where digitally mediated education, particularly in higher education, is more important and more pervasive than ever. How are we going to intervene? Because if we don't, the inequities that that COVID has laid bare, right? Those will continue and those will intensify because we've seen that happen over and over and over. What we cannot do is make decisions based in fear, which is a really easy thing to say, and it's probably really easy to sit here and kind of nod along. Yes, we should not make decisions based in fear. But, I mean, if you're in higher ed, you're kind of scared right now, right? For the last 2 years at my university, everything has been framed as an existential crisis. I work at a small, private, tuition-dependent university. If we mess up moving online, if we don't do HighFlex right, we're going to close. Like, it is exhausting that every routine decision that's being made on campus is seemingly made with existential stakes as the concept. That's not sustainable, right? And we fell into this pattern really quickly during COVID, and I don't see us getting out of it in many significant ways. And that's troubling. The opposite of hope is fear. And so if we're making fear-based decision making, what does that look like? What does it look like when we make decisions based out of fear? When we all went to emergency remote instruction in the spring of 2020, one of the biggest items of discourse we heard was, well, now that students are online, they're going to cheat, of course, right? Because we had lost control. We, in particular faculty, but all of us, right? The narrative was is that we had lost control of the teaching and learning spaces, and once students were out of our control, out in the online wild, wild west, unsupervised and unchaperoned, that the default process was going to be cheating. Even though we have substantial research that suggests that incidences of cheating and academic dishonesty occur no more in an online environment than they do in a face-to-face environment. And even though we know that effective assignment and assessment design are really good ways to stop that process before it even starts. No, we went right to lock the browser down. Shine a webcam on your face while you take a test. What's so hard about that, right? And what was the result of that fear-based decision making? We became hoarders in that sense, right? We felt that we were losing control. We wanted to clutch harder to what we saw as an increasingly scarce resource, that sense of control and certainty. And so one of the ways in which that hoarding, I want to hoard control, I want to hoard power, right? And what does that do? It gave us the illusion of control, but what really happened? A lot of lockdown browser companies in places like Proctorio made a lot of money, right? What if we'd spent that money on something else? What would we be doing differently now that we can't? So when we make decisions based on fear, we get ourselves into places that we would be horrified to know about if we were fully cognizant of it. We get ourselves into places where we see students as adversaries and not allies. We get ourselves into places where fear is governing rather than hope. And it makes us particularly susceptible to what we might call the cult of innovation. I am fully cognizant that this is the conference of innovations and technology. But let me challenge us, and I say us because I am a tech geek and I love that discourse as well, right? But let's critically unpack this a little bit. When we talk about innovation in higher education, when we talk about innovation as a society, what is it that we're really talking about? How do we use that term? And how does that language, how does that choice that we've made frame our sense of what's possible, what's likely, what's desirable, right? And so in the tradition of first-year college student essays everywhere, Webster's Dictionary defines innovation as, right? But if you do a Google search for innovation, higher education, this is what you get, or at least what you would have gotten 2 days ago when I did the screenshots. Back to this existential crisis framing. Higher ed must innovate or die. The colleges that will innovate, the colleges that innovate will survive. The ones that don't innovate, we can't make any guarantees, right? It is the discourse. Are universities of the past still the future, right? Has the coronavirus pandemic changed higher education forever? I mean, yeah, maybe. But is innovation the answer? Because innovation, to innovate is to, as we most commonly use it, focus on the novel, right? This is how we talk about it so much. Changes, newness, introducing something that hasn't been there before. How many of you, and you don't have to publicly answer, but think about it, in your own position, many of you work directly with instructional technology, many of you are involved in some of the strategic decisions that go in. How many of you feel the pressure is to do something new, whether it works or not sometimes, right? What's great about this thing? Well, we don't have it. And it's expensive. How could it not be cool, right? And I'm sure this doesn't happen anywhere here, but I know in universities with which I am familiar, an outside person, a consultant, if you will, an innovation expert perhaps, will come in and say, you should do these things. And the administration will say, my God, that's genius. Even if half the faculty and staff there have been saying you should do these things for the last 10 years. It's the outside voice because it's new. It's magic, right? And I would say I'm exaggerating for comic effect, but I'm really not exaggerating, right? Like, exactly. That's the best satire, right? So, I mean, how demoralizing is that, though? Right? Because what you're doing when you do that as an institution is you're telling people who have the most invested and who have invested that for the longest in your community that you've never been listening to them. And you're telling other people that what they do doesn't matter because it's this outside stuff that matters. That the cool stuff is outside, that the inside is lame, is boring, it's not what students want, it's not innovative, it's not disruptive, right? Unless we say, well, higher education is full of a lot of smart people. Certainly we wouldn't fall for that kind of stuff, right? But think about how we obsess over new methods, new products. And again, I have met some really wonderful vendors at this conference, and there are some cool new products out there. And we should absolutely be talking about those things. What can they do in the service of learning? Not because they're new, but what can they do in the service of teaching and learning, right? Because when we get stuck up in this sort of newness of this innovation discourse, we become this guy, right? So many times when I hear discussions about innovations in higher ed, if you've never seen the movie Office Space, you should absolutely fix that as soon as possible. But I find myself thinking of the boss in Office Space, right? Like, if you could do the CPS reports, yeah, that would be great, right? And so you get this sort of meaningless discourse that checks all the boxes of the sort of corporate environment, but underneath it is nothing. But again, you say, well, it's a good thing we don't do that in higher ed, right? Remember them? Remember MOOCs? That was fun, right? They're going to take over higher education. They are disruptive innovation, disrupt or die, right? I don't know how many of you followed, I think it was 2012 when the University of Virginia Board of Visitors decided they were going to fire the president without telling anybody, including the president, which was awkward. But one of the things that they were really upset about was that the president seemed to be dragging her feet on getting UVA involved in MOOCs. Now, none of the Board of Visitors could tell you what a MOOC was or why but it was new and it was online, and if UVA wasn't involved and like the Ivy League schools were, that was a problem. So out with the president. And if you followed that, it was the implosion of shared governance on the campus of one of the most elite universities in the country. Now, the president stayed. Some people on the board did not. But the damage from that, I just visited UVA to talk about innovation, actually, a few weeks ago. And the scars are still wide open there. That can destroy an institution that isn't as strong as UVA. That president is no longer there, but for other reasons. Disrupting the traditional classroom. Innovate. Why? Because if you don't, you die. Right? So back to this existential, that is not sustainable. That does not work. That does not instill a sense of hope or agency or pathways for the members of your community. Right? And I would also call our attention to some of the rhetoric. I mean, MOOCs are a great example of innovation discourse run amok, right? Because we know what happened, right? It was a flash in the pan. And MOOCs still exist, but it turns out that lecturing in front of 500 people in a lecture hall doesn't get any better when it's in front of 50,000 people on the internet as well, right? Look at retention rates, right? MOOCs were a money-making machine and a branding device, and they were pretty effective at that, but even that had a limited shelf life. And so what do we do when we make decisions based on fear? The kids call it FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. What if we don't adopt MOOCs? Fire the president if he doesn't want to do it, right? And I would also ask, when we say MOOCs are disrupting the traditional classroom, what's the traditional classroom? Is this a traditional classroom? What's that? Kind of, but not really, right? If we want to, I'm a historian, right? So for me, a traditional classroom is like a one-room schoolhouse with kids writing on slate, right? The scratching of quills and clay. A one-room schoolhouse is in ancient Mesopotamia with cuneiform, right? Like, what is the tradition? Our senses of these things, the context change. And so when we fall prey to this innovation discourse, we make binary assumptions. We overgeneralize, we oversimplify, we lose nuance, we lose complexity. Even if this thing of the day is the global education game changer, which it was, just not in the ways that one might have hoped, right? And when we think innovation writ broadly as a society, who are the people that pop into our mind's eye? Who do we lift up in our society as innovators? Probably people like this, right? You sense a theme? So, what does innovation discourse make us susceptible to? It makes us susceptible to the myth that an individual can just roll in as long as they're from the outside, or they do things different, or they're a maverick, or they're an outsider, or they're a disruptor, and they can make changes, and that will fix everything. So the long-standing systemic problems that we have in institutions like higher ed, if we were just innovate harder, or bring in another innovator, or listen to the innovators like Elon Musk who are out there, right? Because clearly they know something we don't, and they probably do, but I'm not sure I want to know it. Right? And I'm not sure that it's what I need to do this thing in higher ed. We fall into this myth. That's why movies like Dead Poets Society are so popular, even among educators. And I will fully disclose, I hate this movie. And that may make you hate me, and that's okay. And if it's a dear movie to you, I apologize for that. But people are saying, Mr. Keating was everything okay. I'm like, did you see what happened to everybody? Like, not good things, right? If that's innovation, one person coming in to make the changes, to disrupt the status quo, to innovate us out of trouble. And so when we buy into that discourse, more often than not, what we do is we expand, we reproduce, and we intensify the already existing inequalities and inequities that we have. Innovation discourse gets us cases like this. A few months ago, you may have followed this David Sabatini, who was apparently a very innovative researcher in some area of microbiology that I don't know anything about, but I do know he was a 3-time accused serial harasser and sexual predator who got fired by places like MIT and Carnegie Mellon. And then NYU said, he's an innovator. His research must be in the field, and we're going to hire him. And when your own community is picketing you over a personnel decision, that's a sign of ill health, institutionally speaking. Right? But that's what innovation discourse gets you, the innovation or the sense of the innovation. And this is always what the innovator looks like, white and male. And we're willing to overlook, in this case, the fact that he is a serial predator. That is not under dispute. But the innovation he brings is more important. That's what NYU told everybody in its community. Eventually, Sabatini withdrew from the search after public outcry. NYU did not withdraw him. And that was telling. Where do we go when we make decisions based on fear? We're going to lose out on innovation. What if we looked at where innovation, the word, comes from? This might offer us a way out of that trap, where we can still talk about innovative things, and we can still think about innovative practices, but we can do so in a way that doesn't handcuff us to reproducing many of the problems that we already have. So I failed Latin my first semester of undergraduate, full disclosure. But I did double check to make sure that I was right when I put up the etymology here, the word root of innovation, coming from the Latin innovat, which is renewed or altered, right? Or the verb, the infinitive form is innovare, which means into, but also make new. So it doesn't have to be novel, brand new, sprung out of Zeus's head, fully formed. It can be something already there that we have renewed, that we have made like new, right? What if we thought about innovation that way? Because then we wouldn't be dependent on that outsider discourse. Then we wouldn't be dependent on the Lone Ranger riding in to fix all of the things that we supposedly can't fix ourselves. What if the innovation was coming from inside the house already? What can we alter? What can we renew? What can we take and make new? Let me suggest briefly 3 areas in which innovation, grounded in a larger ethic of hope, not fear, might guide us in this uncertain next chapter of higher ed. The first area, hybridity. We've been talking about hybrid over the last couple of years for quite a while, right? In the digital learning realm, hybrid classes has at least a somewhat specific definition, although with much of the terms that we use, right, there's more than one way to think about it. But what if I suggested that learning has always been hybrid and that we can talk about a specific course modality, in person and online, and that is hybrid? Well, haven't we been doing in-person and online stuff for a really long time already, even if we didn't call it hybrid? So I'll make these slides available after the talk because I linked to an article here by Anders Norgaard, who I think frames this in a really provocative way, and he's drawing upon work that was done before COVID, which I also think is important, right? Because he's talking about what he calls post-digital lifelong learning. So what does it mean for folks to learn beyond childhood? What does it mean for adult learners like the ones who we work with in our classrooms, right? Norgaard posits that there are no sharp contrasts between digital, online, or distributed learning, between those environments and the physical environments. No contrast, right? No contrast between on-site or co-located environments. The digital is as natural, real, and authentic, and inherently entangled in our everyday learning interactions as non-digital, which is a fancy way of saying the digital has always been with us even before COVID, right? I look out and see tablets and phones and laptops. We are always interacting in these ways. Learning is hybrid, and it has been for a lot longer than we've really been talking about it intentionally. So what does that mean to acknowledge then? How can we make new the idea that learning at its most effective and meaningful has always been hybrid, and what does that mean for us going forward? One thing it might suggest is when we talk about what students want after COVID, students want the in-person experience again. Well, yeah, maybe. It's easier to have dorm parties like that, right? But do they want full in-person, no digital? No. Do they want no online offerings whatsoever? No. The modalities that we sort of had scaled out before COVID, that we scaled out intensively during COVID, can we unring that bell? Can we stir things apart once they've been stirred together? Or can we lean into the notion that, yes, hybridity has always been a thing. And we can do this well, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. In fact, we should actually embrace it, right? Learning at its most effective has always been hybrid. It's always been a hybrid of these things, right? We've always had digital and analog. We've always had abstract but also embodied curriculum. Learning is always taking place inside whatever teaching and learning space, but outside as well. You know, this is the stuff we've been talking about in higher education forever, right? The most meaningful learning you'll ever have in college takes place outside of the classroom. I heard that when I rolled into James Madison University in August of 1990, before email was a thing, right? Learning was hybrid then, right? Learning is a hybrid of cognitive and affective. Learning can reaffirm, but learning can also unsettle. When we start thinking about these things, we stop seeing this as mutually exclusive binaries, and we start seeing them as hybrids. Learning is both blank and blank, not either blank or blank. And again, we sort of know this on an intellectual level, but what does it look like to be intentional, explicit, and then operationalize that going forward? How do we lean into hybridity? So our first innovation, our first renewal or making new then for this next chapter in higher ed, embrace that hybridity. Think about what it means in all its complexity and how we might more effectively meet the needs, the interests, and the motivations of more and more of the students than we are effectively now. The second area I would challenge us to rethink, to renew, is the idea of presence, right? We know that at its fundamental level, learning is social, right? If you've ever read Josh Eiler's book, How Humans Learn, he has a chapter in there about sociality, which is, I highly recommend, really made me think about a lot of the things that we assume about learning and the ways that we do so in community, right? But even Eiler, well, who talks a lot about more traditional than online classrooms, would not say that learning as a social endeavor means the exact same thing as learning is always in person, right? And there's no better group to know that, you know, community doesn't have to happen synchronously or in a co-located way. And in fact, a lot of what all of us in this room have been doing for the last 2 years is trying to convince everybody else of that, right? That has been our work. So we should be asking, who's in this space? And how are they in this space? How can they be in this space? So there are folks who are attending this talk here in the room. There are folks who are attending virtually. And as much as all of us like to say that we're sick of Zoom, and I too am sick of Zoom, what are the affordances that things like this do offer us, though? Right? From a universal design perspective, we did a thing to address COVID, high flex or remote attendance and things like that. But how many of our students are going to benefit from that kind of stuff, even in a time where COVID isn't the primary driver? My university, 2/3 of our students are student athletes. They travel. They can attend class virtually now. They can see a recording of the class, even if they can't attend virtually. Like, there are all sorts of those sort of things that we sort of rushed into place for COVID that are going to benefit learning, right? So we need to reassess who's in this space and how are they in this space. But on the flip side of that, we need to continually ask ourselves as well and challenge ourselves. Who isn't in this space and why? What is preventing them from being here? Right? And that is a real easy thing for me as a tenured full professor white male to stand up in front of a room of mostly white people to say, who isn't in this space? Who isn't in this space and why? What are the structural barriers, especially in realms like technology, where we know that disparities to both access and participation exist? Who isn't in this space and why? And of course, the implied next question after that is, and what are we going to do about it? As educators, we are in the barrier removal business. Who's not here and why aren't they here? So we know from the research on online learning that as we tried to untie the very difficult knot of trying to do pandemic pedagogy and to do it well, even though we know that learning is social, how do we do that when it's a whole bunch of students with their Zoom cameras on, right? How do we do that when students are in 5 different time zones in a class, or that it's asynchronous? And a lot of us in here know that there are models in place. There are researchers and scholars who have been talking about these questions since online learning was a thing. And online learning has been a thing a lot longer than many people realize, right? And so one of the things that's emerged from that research is the community of inquiry model, which is a fairly kind of bread and butter approach in the online teaching community, where we talk about, the types of presence that go into creating community. You can do community. You can foster connectedness in a fully remote asynchronous class. You just have to think about it in different ways than an on-site traditional face-to-face class might. And so the key elements that the scholarship of this model identifies: instructor presence, cognitive presence, and perhaps the most important, social presence. Right? And so I belabor this point because to me this offers a really great example of what did we learn during COVID that we can now scale out, right? The online research is pretty robust behind the efficacy of the community of inquiry model. We know a lot about how we can promote social presence and a sense of connection in particular among our students. There is nothing in there that says that only works for online teaching. And in fact, when we look at the way that scholars who research social presence have talked about the components of it, when we look at what goes into creating effective social presence, I don't see anything in here that is exclusive to any modality of teaching and learning, right? And when I show this to colleagues who've never taught online before, and said, this is the kind of things that we can do online, they'll say, well, I've done this in my face-to-face class already. And that's the point. We can do this regardless of modality. So in particular, one of the things that I think stands out that we can use as a way going forward to think about more effective teaching and learning is this idea of interaction intensity, right? And so Amy Whiteside and her colleagues, when they talk about this model of how to create social presence, emphasize the fact that it's not just interacting with people in these teaching and learning spaces, it's the ways and the intensity with which those interactions are occurring, which put into more sort of everyday language that many of you taught online can relate to. Blackboard discussion posts aren't enough, right? You can't just say, hey, I want to post a prompt and, you write a reply and then respond to 2 classmates and then we've got community, right? That stuff sucks. We know that doesn't work, right? That's not social presence because it's not an intense, it's a rote interaction. It's pro forma. How do we cultivate intensive interaction that ask our students to do complex cognitive tasks, that ask them to create rather than just regurgitate knowledge? How do we do those things? How do we cultivate intense interaction as a method of helping students be fully present in this social sense that I am seen, not in spite of, but because of who I am in this community of learners, whether that's a fully face-to-face, hybrid, or fully remote class. That I am a full and complicated human being, I am seen as that, and I see other people in this class as one too. That's social presence. And to me, when we look at all of the things that we're facing in terms of declining enrollment and student disconnection, I mean, every week the Chronicle of Higher Education has a new article about the Great Disconnect. It's usually right next to the one about the Great Resignation, neither of which I find great, but apparently here we are, right? What's one? How do you reconnect, especially in academics, the heart of the enterprise of higher education? You can do all sorts of great things co-curricularly on campus, and many campuses do, but if you're not working on connection and presence inside teaching and learning spaces, then that work is going to be incomplete and ineffective. So how are we building presence? So that's the second thing I would challenge us to innovate, that is to make new or to renew. Cultivate and sustain presence in a meaningful and genuine way. And of course, that depends on the third area I want to put in front of you. This idea of belonging. You cannot be fully present in a space to which you do not think you belong. Think about a time in your own academic career, from kindergarten all the way up to when you walked in the doors to this room right now, or when you logged on to view this virtually. Think about a time where you were told that you did not belong in that space, that you were excluded. Think about how that felt. Think about the consequences, the short and the long-term consequences of that. What doors shut? What paths aren't taken? Exclusion, non-belonging, has tremendously impactful consequences. A sense of belonging underlays almost everything that we're trying to do here in higher ed. Which begs the question then, how do our students know they belong? How do they know, for example, that they're welcome on campus? What do you do on your campuses to tell your students welcome? And the first answer that almost all of you would give is we do a welcome week. They roll onto campus at the beginning of the year, we do an orientation. Sometimes we even call it welcome week to really emphasize that you are welcome. And that's great and that's wonderful, but what about week 2? Right? What happens in week 3 when those sort of first academic assessments roll in? And maybe things didn't happen the way that the students were hoping. How do they feel about things? Do they still feel welcome in college then? How do we know? How do they know? So this idea of belonging is essential for our practice. And again, COVID showed us what the absence of a sense of belonging can do. And the fallout from that is very much with us now. So some of you might be familiar about the research on student belonging because it is, again, resurfaced in a lot of the discourse around higher ed and student success. But the idea that, students' sense of belonging can often be attenuated, can be uncertain, has been with us for a while. And we have some really good literature that shows us the dimensions of this problem, right? So Walton and Cohen's work back in 2007 identified what they called belonging uncertain, right? Has anybody ever heard of imposter syndrome? Most of us went to graduate school. And if you went to graduate school, you know what imposter syndrome is, right? Because that's what grad school does. Belonging uncertainty is akin to that. This idea that, a terrible mistake has been made and that I was let into this space, but the gig's going to be up soon, right? And for students, this can be particularly intense and particularly problematic when it comes to things like academic success, persistence, and retention. So what Walton and Cohen identify is this sense, belonging uncertainty, they say, is that students are coming to us. And in particular, students who are first gen, students from racially minoritized groups, and students from lower socioeconomic status. Not exclusively, but often students who fall into these areas, and we know that many of our students are at the intersections of one or more of those areas, are particularly report in disproportionate numbers experiencing this sense of belonging uncertainty. And so students have come to us with a hypothesis already in place, right? And their working hypothesis says people like me do not belong here. And of course, we know from the psychologists, right? Confirmation bias is a thing. If we have a hypothesis in place, we are super attuned to evidence which seems to confirm that hypothesis, even to the exclusion of evidence that refutes it. So the problem for us then, for students with belonging uncertainty who are looking for evidence to support their hypothesis, they usually find it. They're told implicitly, explicitly, sometimes both, that you do not belong here. And follow-up research from Terrell Strayhorn, who wrote a book on student belonging that I highly recommend, revisits some of Walton and Cohen's conclusions. And what Strayhorn finds is that it only takes once, that one single instance of being told that you don't belong, to undermine a general sense of belonging to the point where that student becomes more likely to stop out, to leave. And so think about the mission of the institution that you work at. Your university, your college's mission statement. Those are promises. And I know as faculty, we like to make fun of mission statements as kind of corporate speak, but missions are important. Your mission is the promise that you make to both internal and external communities, that you make to prospective students. Why should I come to Oswego? Our mission says, here are the values that you can expect us to adhere to, right? It's a promise we make to students. So for every student who stops out, that's mission failure. And so for students who are told or who feel, who get the sense that they do not belong, they will stop out. It's not if, but when. So how do we cultivate a sense of belonging? One of the ways in which we do that is we are mindful of the effects of what Henry Giroux and other critical pedagogues call the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum, as Giroux writes, are the norms, values, and beliefs that aren't formally stated. Like, they're not the learning outcomes on my syllabus. But I am likely teaching those things perhaps even more effectively than the formal curriculum. Right? So we have research that suggests, for example, in discussion-based classes where discussion is one of the primary modes of engagement and interaction, that no matter who the professor is, and no matter what the ratio of male to female presenting students is in that class, that it is often the case. We don't know if it's universal or statistically true all the time, but it is often the case that female students will get called on after male students, or that female students will be interrupted by male students more often than the reverse is true. And again, no matter what the ratio of students is in that class. So if an instructor like me is in front of class who's not aware of these tendencies, and I am calling on male students before female students, depending on, even if they haven't raised their hand first, or if I allow male students to talk over female students and not call them out on it or say, let so-and-so finish, we need to adhere to our expectations here. If I don't intervene in that, what are the female students in my class learning? They're not learning the content so much as they're learning whose voice gets heard, whose voice matters and whose doesn't, who gets to break the rules, like interrupt, and who doesn't, right? And that's not just in the classroom. The next time you go to a committee meeting or a faculty meeting, especially if you're a dude like me, count how many times that stuff happens. And I see a lot of women in here nodding their heads, right? That's the hidden curriculum, because the lessons that are being learned there are lessons that I, as an instructor, would be horrified to know that I was teaching, yet they are being taught nonetheless. And they are being learned in a much more powerful and meaningful way than whatever the course content might happen to be. And this is true all over campus. Our entire campuses, physical and virtual, are teaching and learning spaces. Our students are always learning. They're learning in the business office, they're learning in financial aid, they're learning in the cafeteria, they're learning online, they're learning in the class, they're learning in the dorm, they're learning in the quad, they're learning in the parking lot. What are they learning? What are we teaching them? Do our students know that they belong? Do our students know that they can be not just recipients, but creators of knowledge? Because isn't that what the enterprise of higher education is all about? Right? We're not just going to stuff stuff into your head, what Paulo Freire called the banking model, right? We want you to be active participants in the knowledge creation process. but do students see themselves reflected in that process? So again, a couple days ago, if you'd have Googled science professor, this is what you would have gotten. Or just professor. Who gets to create knowledge? Whose voices are authoritative? And by extension, whose aren't? Who has platforms? And who doesn't? And in case it's too subtle for you, I'll give you a hint again. Do our students see themselves reflected in our field, our discipline, the higher ed environment? They do not, in many cases. What are we going to do about it? Because that is critical to a sense of belonging. Are we telling students that people who look like you are here on our higher educational space, but they only work in maintenance or food service? What are our students like? Whose voices get to be scholarly? Who gets to create knowledge? At its aspirational best, higher education says to all of its students, you get to create knowledge, and we will give you the tools to do that. In practice, that is not how it's working. And that is certainly not what we're conveying to our students, in particular in introductory level courses. A sense of belonging is absolutely critical for success in higher education, right? Back to Walton and Cohen's research. A lot of times when people look at, promoting belonging, compassionate pedagogy, what Kate Denial calls a pedagogy of kindness, right? When people look at student-centered learning, when people look at critiques of things like rigor, there's a perception that it's just a whole bunch of people in class sitting around in a circle singing Kumbaya or some other hippy-dippy crap, right? And that no real learning is happening, right? If we coddle the students, what about rigor, right? Well, when you say rigor, I think of corpses, right? We cannot, I want to be very clear. I am not anti-challenge. I think learning should be challenging. And if it's not, we're not doing something right. Higher education should absolutely challenge people. It should challenge your prior assumptions. It should challenge what you think your capabilities are. It should challenge you to push beyond what you thought your limits were and achieve great things. But you can't do that stuff if students don't trust you or if they think you don't trust them. People who have a trusting relationship with a teacher or a mentor are better able, Walton and Cohen argue, to take advantage of critical feedback. In other words, not this paper is great, but this paper has some problems. And let's talk about what those look like. Students aren't going to be able to take advantage and to respond to those things effectively and successfully if they do not have trust. At its root, belonging then for students is, can I trust this place and the people in it? And if the answer to that is no, then the student will not feel a sense of belonging, and none of the good stuff that we say higher education could and should be doing will happen. So being challenging is not going in front of a class on the first day and saying, look to your left, look to your right. Only 2 of you will be here at the end of the semester because I'm a badass, right? That is not it at all. What challenging is creating a space where students trust in the space and in you, that you can challenge them in ways that would not have been possible without that environment being created. Keeping students at the center in this sense means, and this sounds like a truism, but it's harder to put into practice. Students can't be at the center if we are marginalizing them. So who are we marginalizing on our campuses? The answer to that may be different depending on the class, depending on the context, depending upon the time of day or the time of year. How are we keeping all of our students at the center? So that's the third innovation, the third renewal or making new that I would like to suggest. Create a culture of belonging. Create a culture where none of our students is told, you do not belong here. It is not enough to say at first, you belong here. And then once the tuition check clears, let us know if you need anything, right? That's not enough. How are we welcoming students, but how are we re-welcoming students? I learned an insight that was a surprising, but I think an effective one from one of the athletic coaches on my campus. He said, recruiting students is easy. It's re-recruiting them that's hard, right? To get them to come back even after the first year of practice, seeing what college athletics is like, to get them to come back and re-engage in that challenge, that's the hard work, he said. How are we welcoming but re-welcoming our students? How are we creating a culture of belonging? And so moving into this next chapter of higher education, uncertain as it may be, but with a clear sense that the status quo is unsustainable, right? We should be asking ourselves the innovation questions in this sense. What can we alter? What can we renew? What can we make new? And I emphasize this because everything I just talked about, the collective capacity in this room and online right now is immense. There is an enormous amount of resources, a huge fund of knowledge collectively with all of you gathered in this event to answer those questions and to answer them well and effectively. The capacity in this room to affect that kind of innovation is significant. And don't lose sight of that. And don't sell yourself short. Everything you do is informed by this larger ideological vision. And yes, I say ideological purpose, right? Our pedagogy, the way that we go about this work is practice, and practice always derives from theory. It's like the David Foster Wallace story, This Is Water. Has anybody heard that? Two young fish swimming through the water, and the older fish is swimming alongside it. The older fish turns to the younger fish and says, "Oh, great day, the water's wonderful. Isn't it a wonderful day to be in the ocean?" The two younger fish are like, "Okay, yeah, cool," and they go swimming on. About 5 minutes later, one of the younger fish turns to the other one and says, "What the hell is water?" Right? Like, how do we explain the water we're in? How do you explain your pedagogy? Whether you are a traditional classroom instructor or not, you are in higher education. You are a teacher. You teach. What's your pedagogy? What do you believe about how learning works and how it works best, about who can learn and who should learn and who learns best and what that looks like? And what is your position in relation to the learning process? What is your theory that's guiding your practice? Because you can ignore the question, but as the great existential philosophical trio Rush tells us, if you choose not to decide, you're still choosing. You're still deciding something. And this is too important to decide by default. Right? Think back to the observation. Structures of inequality reproduce themselves by default unless we actively intervene. Punting on the choice is not an active intervention. And so really all of this work that we're about starts with us. Gil Scott Heron famously said, the first revolution is when you change your mind. The simple act of saying no is revolutionary. The simple acknowledgement that where we are is unsustainable and a different future is possible. And not only is it possible, but desirable and achievable. That is a revolutionary act. This is how revolutions start. We have the agency, and we can find the pathways to undertake that work. That is what a pedagogy of hope is grounded in, I would suggest. That ethic. Because again, the opposite is not sustainable. The opposite leads us away from what it is that we say we're about and we say that we do. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian philosopher and educator, wrote about hopelessness. So when it becomes a program, hopelessness paralyzes us. It immobilizes us. We succumb to fatalism. How can we address the problems we face in a time of monsters if we're fatalistic? If we give up? If it becomes impossible, to use Freire's words, to muster the strength that we absolutely need for a fierce struggle that will recreate the world. And again, that may sound like overwrought language. Sometimes it doesn't feel like my medieval world history class at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday, Wednesday, Friday is a fierce struggle to recreate the world. But it is. It's a part of that struggle. because I am in the barrier removing and door opening business. This is how it happens. Student by student, class by class, program by program, institution by institution. That is how the world is recreated. I am hopeful, Freire says, not out of mere stubbornness, but out of an existential, concrete imperative. In the literal sense, there is no acceptable alternative. The stakes are high. The urgency is there. The work we do is essential and important. How are we doing it with and among one another in solidarity with each other and with our students? My challenge to you as we think back on a very fraught academic year and look forward to a probably just as uncertain academic year coming down the pike. My challenge to you is to commit radical acts of hope. Commit them early, commit them often. Commit them with one another, but commit them nonetheless. With that at the center, even if the shape of the future is indeterminate, it makes the present inhabitable. That's the challenge. Will we take it up? I think so. Thank you for letting me join you. Thank you for letting me be a part of the conference this meeting. And I hope that this has been as meaningful and as good an event for you as it has been for me over the last few days. Thanks.
For some questions, if anyone would like to raise a question. Well, actually, if you could yell it out from that side of the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you are not alone in doing so, right? Which for many of our students, in particular first-year students, just that affirmation, like, I'm not the only one who's a little anxious. I mean, that is a powerful moment for them. You ever see Dune or read Dune, right? Like, fear is the mind killer. I will let it wash over you. Yeah, that's a lot of Dune. But I do like the passage, and I've put that up on the screen before for students, and a lot of them think I'm just some sort of irredeemable geek. So, but fear in that, it's like a tool, right? We use tools, but tools can also use us. And so one of the most essential things we're trying to do with students, right? How do you use the tools, and how do you learn to use them in skillful and multiple ways rather than letting the tools use you? And the same is true for fear, I think. So I love the observation that you made. I think that's great. Thanks. Yes. Oh, you got a microphone coming.
Thank you. So I think you came to the heart of the matter when you spoke about praxis. And I think the fundamental problem we have in the system of higher education, and when I say system, I mean producing PhDs.
Right.
And I don't mean you, but producing PhDs, who we then send out into the world when we've spent 7+ years, smashing their brains about quantitative statistics. Yes, we know those who are doing it. And we spend yes, Cheryl, I am working on it. I will go back to my PhD. Thank you. Cheryl has to remind me that this is a life goal. But my point is, there's zero preparation to teach. There's zero exposure to theories of learning. Isn't that a point of fundamental change that has to happen?
It absolutely is. And it's happening in places, but it's not happening in ways that are challenging us as an academic culture to reshape ourselves. So some university systems, if you've ever heard of the preparing future faculty programs, Some of those have really strong pedagogical components. Some programs and departments with which I'm familiar in history have really leaned into, there's a required class for graduates, which is basically an introduction to pedagogy, right? But as any of us know, right, institutional change or culture change in academia is like trying to parallel park a battleship, right? And so right now we're kind of trying to, what's frustrating for those of us who see this as kind of an easy fix, right? You can do this stuff, as the admins call it, is low-hanging fruit. And so it becomes frustrating to see us not leaning into the way or thinking very hard about the way that we're training our graduate students, not for the careers that we might have or the careers that we want or the careers that we thought we were going to get, but training graduate students for the careers that are out there. And if that's within academia, because it's a vital question on a number of levels. First, how are we reproducing our own discipline, right? Because who we're teaching in the 100-level courses, that's the next generation of our practitioners, right? And are we abdicating that opportunity? In many cases, we are, right? And then how are we reproducing ourselves institutionally, right? Persistence and retention. How many times do you hear those words on a daily basis, right? If we're not teaching effectively, students aren't learning, students don't feel connected, students don't feel a sense of belonging, students don't feel any of the things that we know are absolutely essential for retention. And in a very sort of nuts and bolts way, that means we can't pay the electric bill, right? We can't pay, we start removing programs. And once you're in that cycle, and in the small private college world, we see this happening already, right? Once you're getting rid of people and programs, you're circling the drain. How can you fix that? I mean, it's a multi-factor solution, of course, but a good start, an essential start, is retaining the students that you already have. And all too often, we have a culture that does not reward the things that are necessary for us to do that. So the more we name it, the more we identify, the more we bang on the table. And if you're at an institution with graduate programs, part of your agency in this agency pathways thing is to figure out and to help empower others onto how to weave these things more effectively into graduate training. Absolutely essential. So I appreciate you saying that.
I appreciate what you were saying about the outsider coming in and saying we need new technology. And I consider myself, I work in a teaching learning technology center, but I consider myself a technology skeptic. I don't just say, yes, this is a new tool, it's great. I appreciate having a framework that you say of when we look at technology, how do we think of it as establishing belonging or presence? And yeah, I read a lot of Audrey Waters and kind of think about a space of how do we look at this in a clear way to say what is useful in the classroom and not. And so just didn't know if you had any other thoughts on how you tackle that problem when it comes to you of new technology coming to your campus.
That's a great question and an essential point, I think, because it is easy to let the technology drive the decisions rather than the other way around. And the larger scale the decision, the more susceptible we are to that, right? You mentioned Audrey Waters. If you haven't read Audrey Waters, read Audrey Waters. She's one of the smartest voices on educational technology that you'll ever come across. And what I like about Audrey and what I like about the point that you're raising is, it's okay to be skeptical about technology, even if you're working in tech, right? In fact, you should be more skeptical working in tech because you see how the sausage is made, so to speak, right? One of the things that we do at my university that has been super effective is our IT folks, our teaching and learning center folks, and our faculty senate have it's informal now, but we started an informal strategy working group. We met monthly just to sort of, what is technology strategy here? What's happening in the classrooms right now? What's happening in our out-of-class technology? What roadblocks are students running into? What roadblocks are faculty and staff running into? What decisions are in the pipeline? How are we going to make those decisions collectively? And just having folks who don't normally cross paths on a regular basis at the table together, even during COVID, we did it over Zoom, talking with one another about these questions. And even if we didn't come to resolution, that wasn't the point. The point was we were creating a space where we could have those conversations for when we needed to make decisions or cut checks or do those sorts of things. And having, our IT folks, what it's helped them do is become less mysterious to faculty. What it's helped me as a teaching center director do is to help faculty understand that IT is not their enemy, but rather their facilitator. And if we're able to, we want the same things. We're just coming at the question sometimes from different perspectives. And so we need to make sure both those perspectives are there in the room. So what are the structural things that we can do, even on an informal basis, that are modeling those types of collaborations? Because if we're not doing this collaboratively, and I know sometimes collaboratively turns into bureaucratically, but if we're not doing it collaboratively, then we're going to make decisions that we regret probably pretty quickly, especially in an age of sort of resource scarcity, right? So that would be my biggest suggestion, is to think about ways that we can build in the capacity to get people together who, and it seems like an easy answer, and you're probably like, that's not very revolutionary at all. But like in our day-to-day work, when we're all in the weeds among our own stuff, it's very easy to lose sight of just how easy we should be, it should be to do those things and to make them happen. Yes.
Wait.
Oh, here comes John. John's going to get his steps in by the end of the day.
I really appreciate the perspective on Radical Hope, that you need a path forward. And one of the things that I hear from our students is that they are also having a difficult time being hopeful. Ones that are particularly environmentally aware, for example, will say things like, "But humans might not exist in 100 years," which makes it hard to get invested in your education and
Right.
see a path. How do you keep one foot in this kind of space of urgency and space of support and hope for the students who are having a hard time being in touch with their hopefulness?
Well, I think the most important part of that question is to give the students space and acknowledge and affirm that, yes, it is not Oh, I'm sorry. So how do we work with students who are feeling a sense of hopelessness? Environmental catastrophe, all of the things that are happening right now. How do we? And students are expressing this sense of impending doom. What does this stuff matter if this is what's on the horizon? And I think the first part is acknowledge the fact that this is not an irrational thing. Like, this is a perfectly reasonable response to everything that's happening, and to try to create space for that. But space where we don't just sit in hopelessness, as Ferry would say, with no alternative, right? Because nothing is inevitable. Things are likely, and some things are likelier than others, but nothing is inevitable. And so working with students in that sense is, how do we make the connections with what we're doing in a particular class on a particular day with making something seem less inevitable than it otherwise is now, right? So yes, right now the arc that we're on is climate disaster and an uninhabitable planet. It's not inevitable. But how is my being in medieval world history going to change that? So, and it can. It's one small drop in that bucket, but getting students to think about, who are you as a learner? How does this stuff help you do the things that you want to do to create a more just and sustainable future? What on-ramps are going to be available to you as a college graduate? What doors are going to open? And so this experience that we're having now is part of that larger on-ramp for you, part of your agency, part of building your pathways, and getting students to see the interconnectedness of that, building the skills that I have as a learner, putting the tools in my toolbox that I need. I may be a biology major taking medieval world history, but I'm going to get tools here that will help me be a problem solver and a researcher to do the things that I'm passionate about. And that sounds like kind of cheesy college view book stuff, but it's true. But it's so easy to forget. So acknowledging our students being in that space, making it okay to be in that space, but helping them connect being here with the realization that A, nothing is inevitable, and B, you can be part of the agency that makes it less inevitable. A lot of people like to quote the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Arcs don't bend themselves. So challenging our students, right, yeah, let's get a crowbar. You are an arc bender. So how are we going to actualize that? This is one piece of your actualization. So trying to, and that's easier said than done on a lot of days, but keeping students in that space where they can connect an honest reckoning with where we are with a sense of hope toward the future, even if that future is indeterminate, we can keep them in that balance space. Then they see there are alternatives and not inevitabilities. And I think that's really important. Thank you.
I actually came from manufacturing in the 1980s, way before this whole, what's now called continuous improvement and stuff like that. I mean, I remember ISO 9000, the whole, now it's all become buzzwords. But the reality is, and it was in the discussion forum, somebody said, oh, there it is. The excuse, we've always done it this way.
Mhm.
If we truly adopt what really continuous improvement means, it's not radical. Continuous improvement means you see one thing, you see two things, and you change them. And frankly, people are much more willing to adapt to small change
Mhm.
as opposed to, what is evolution versus revolution.
Right?
And I think that if we adopt those continuous improvement practices, we can make change. We just may not see it for a while, and we all like to see that, wow, look how much that changed.
Right.
But the world doesn't work that way.
No, we are in the seed planting business. in
Yeah,
education,
and I
right?
think that's important to remember.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you acknowledge that. Absolutely. Yes. Oh. Yeah, so when people talk about barriers to change as silos, right? And I live in Iowa, so silos are a reality in our landscape. So it's a particularly vivid metaphor, but I will say one thing about that is, so I'm at a small institution, and many of you are at smaller campuses. I think it's almost worse. It's smaller, more teaching-oriented institutions because we tell ourselves, oh, we're a teaching school. Oh, we're small. Everybody knows each other, and act as if just because we say that has made it true, right? And we don't do the work that it takes to maintain that presence. So when I talk about this group with IT and with Faculty Senate and the Teaching Center, I mean, my campus is literally 2 blocks long, right? Like, it's not that hard to get, but we would never get together unless we did a conscious. And so when we talk about getting rid of silos, the absolute way to do that is to recognize the fact that they do exist and that we often perpetuate them implicitly. And so challenging ourselves to be more mindful and intentional about what that looks like. And if you don't think you have silos on your campus, they're probably even bigger. So I realize that I am probably the last thing standing between A, the end of the conference, and B, lunch. And so I don't want to get in the way of either of those things for you. So let me again say thank you for your time and for inviting me to be a part of the space today.
Well, we'll see you all next year in person, I hope. And in the meanwhile, we'll see you all on Zoom. Even in a dream, Kevin just said, or maybe nightmares, as the case may be.